She had it all: money, influence, and an existence so meticulously choreographed that even a slight delay felt out of place. For almost 10 years, the same automobile arrived at her doorstep precisely at 7:15 in the morning, driven by a man who requested nothing, who merely appeared, rain or snow, unobtrusive and faithful. But on a chilly Boston morning, that routine was shattered. The automobile never arrived. And something inside of her stomach knew that this wasn't simply about traffic or an oversleeping. It was the type of quiet that whispered about something more. She could have gone on about her day, called in a backup, and kept her plans on schedule. Instead, she looked. And what she discovered didn't just stun her, it changed her. Because the man who quietly served her for years was carrying such a weighty burden, but had mentioned it to no one. He had lost his house. His body was failing him. Yet he continued to appear, day after day, never asking for assistance. What do we lose when we rush too quickly through our days? When someone arrives with a smile, do we ever stop to wonder what it costs them to do so? This tale isn't about a woman with means. It's about what she did with that means when confronted with a truth she couldn't deny. It's about compassion not always arriving with big speeches and grand gestures, but in listening, in observing, and in quietly telling someone, "I will not let you endure this by yourself." Above all, this story is a reminder that dignity isn't something we bestow, it's something we stand guard over. And often the ones who appear strongest are bearing the greatest burdens quietly right next to us. So, what does one encounter when a person finally sees beyond the facade and decides to give another a lift not out of sympathy, but with intention? Allow me to tell you what transpired after one woman went out looking and discovered not only a driver, but an experience that would change her world forever. It was just past sunrise on a brisk Monday morning in Boston. The kind of morning where the plights just a little, and the streets are still quiet, not yet stirred by the rush of the day. Outside a tall brownstone on Commonwealth Avenue, Margaret Caldwell stood by her front steps, arms gently folded across her tailored wool coat, waiting. She wasn't used to waiting. Not at this time. Not for him. Not for him. For 9 consecutive years, through summer heat and winter storms and everything in between, her driver Ernest had never been late, not ever. He would always be waiting out front at precisely 7 a.m. Blacktown car, shining, motor idling, prepared to drive her to meetings, events, or simply out for a spin to clear her head. In her universe of boardrooms, billion-dollar deals, and high stakes, Ernest was the one jag that never wavered. He was a steady presence, calm, always collected, and above all, dependable. But that morning, as her clock ticked beyond 7:15, something within her altered from vague bewilderment to soft alarm. She glanced down the street again. No headlights, no vehicle. Just quiet. That wasn't like him. Not Ernest. Her driver, a college-aged woman, stuck her head out the door and suggested calling a backup driver, but Margaret shook her head decisively. No, Ernest does not just not show up. Her tone was cool but firm. It wasn't about being late. It was about who was late. And Ernest was not the sort to go a wall without a word. He was the type of fellow who apologized if he was 3 minutes ahead of schedule rather than 5. So, for the first time in years, Margaret took her keys from the side table, got into her luxury SUV, and drove away. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't even know where to look, precisely. But something deep within her whispered, "Go." But what she would shortly discover, sitting on a chilly park bench, swaddled in a coat that was not warm enough, would shatter every assumption she had ever made regarding loyalty, pride, and the unspoken pain that people keep hidden. Margaret started driving through the areas of the city Ernest had spoken of casually over the years. He never spoke of himself much, but she listened. He'd once indicated a small bakery off Dorchester that produced the most wonderful cornbread, that he'd take his deceased wife there. He'd spoken of a church along Blue Hill Avenue where he helped out occasionally, tiny fragments of his existence that, at the time, felt like ambient sounds in the cadence of their daily commutes. But today, those morsels of information seemed like hints. She left the main streets and into the neighborhoods she had not seen in decades, if at all. Her gaze combed each sidewalk, every corner shop, every bus stop. Where was he? Why hadn't he called? The more she looked, the tighter something in her chest became. Ernest wasn't just a worker. He was a part of the beat of her life. Always early, always impeccably dressed, always prepared with a warm good morning, ma'am. In a world of loose allegiances and broken vows, Ernest had been a rock, and that rock had just vanished. And Margaret was starting to feel a terror she refused to identify. What could drive a man so proud, so self-disciplined, to simply disappear without explanation? The response wasn't what she anticipated, and once she caught sight of it, she could never look away. Around 40 minutes into her search, she took a deserted street off of one close to an old park that she vaguely recalled driving past on one trip or another. The trees were leafless, the benches weathered, and the early morning light lay long and spooky shadows over the frost-covered lawn, and that is when she spotted him. She'd assumed at first that it was a man sleeping, perhaps waiting for the bus, but the way he was huddled in a ball, the way his coat was clasped close across his chest, made her pull over. She drew her car to the curb, got out, and looked over. Her heart missed a beat. It was Ernest. He lay sprawled across the bench, head against the armrest, eyes shut, shoes dusty and frayed. He appeared thinner, weary. His normally smooth face now bore stubble, and his hands shook slightly as he came to life. Margaret crept up softly, so as not to wake him. "Ernest," she whispered, her voice low but insistent. He slowly blinked, confusion flashing across his face before recognition made its presence known. And then, a glance she'd never seen in his eyes. "Shame. Ma'am, I'm so sorry," he muttered, sitting up, straightening his coat. "I didn't want you to see me like this." She sat next to him, the chill of the bench coming through her coat, but she didn't mind. He glanced down, blushing, refusing to meet her eyes. "It's not what it seems. I had no other place." Her breath was stuck in her throat. "Ernest, how long have you been out here?" she demanded. He paused, then spoke at last. "3 weeks, ma'am. Maybe a bit longer." He'd been homeless, behind the wheel every day, that same unobtrusive smile, never needing assistance. And the fact hit harder than she could have anticipated. Margaret didn't say anything at first. She simply stared at him, really stared. His coat was too light for the weather. His boots had holes in the bottom of them. And still, for nearly a month, he'd been arriving to take her around, never once asking for payment. He kept coming, kept dressing up, kept arriving on time, until this one morning when his body just collapsed. "Why didn't you tell me?" she finally demanded. He smiled wearily, softly. "Didn't want sympathy. Didn't want to lose the job. It was the last thing I had." At that instant, Margaret experienced a jumble of feelings: guilt, shock, protectiveness. But most of all, she sensed something change in herself. This wasn't a faithful employee who had hit rock bottom. This was a man who had suffered quietly, with grace, never seeking a handout, only an opportunity. And Margaret felt, as she sat next to him on that chilly bench, that giving him a few dollars or a room in the hotel for the evening would never be enough. Not for Ernest, not for someone who had so much given and never once sought anything back. Margaret Caldwell decided that morning, not because of guilt, but because something more ran deep. She wouldn't merely assist him, she would transform his life, undefined, and in doing so, she would surprise everyone. She didn't expect to see him, not exactly, but Margaret drove anyway, going on gut, turning down residential streets and into neighborhoods Ernest had made passing conversation about in all the years of long rides, good barbecue places, a friend's corner store, the church his mother had gone to. She hadn't paid much attention at the time, but now those little things seemed like breadcrumbs. The further away she drove from the center of the city, the stranger everything seemed: broken sidewalks, rusty fences, parks that hadn't been repainted in years. And just as she was turning back, she noticed something. A small park between two rundown buildings close to Dorchester, almost obscured behind a row of bare trees. It seemed abandoned, but as her car crept slowly by, she saw a figure bundled up on one of the benches, bent against the cold morning. Something in her chest clutched. She pulled over without even looking for traffic. She knew. She got out, heels crunching softly on the frost-covered ground, and took a few hesitant steps forward. The man's shoulders hunched, his knees drawn in, jacket huddled around him as if he were attempting to efface himself. But then she spotted the shoes, recognizable, still shiny from last week's polishing, and the faded cap he wore whenever it rained. Her breathing stopped. It was Ernest. And in that instant, the world had slowed down. The man who had opened doors for her each day, the cat, was now sleeping on one, out in the cold, abandoned by the world. She moved forward quietly, not wanting to wake him. Close up, it was even more tragic. His once starched uniform was creased and frayed. His complexion seemed weary, his face thinner, older in some way. And his hands, those sure hands that had driven through Boston traffic with such ease, quivered gently as he stirred into consciousness. "Ernest," she whispered, tone low, eyes fixed on him. He blinked slowly, as if stirring from a dream he didn't want to be caught in. And when his eyes met hers, everything in his expression seemed to crumble. His eyes brimmed, not with tears, but with something even more burdensome: shame. not because he was discovered, but because she had witnessed him thus, bereft of the pride he'd ever had. He sat up slowly, cinching his coat around him, and breathed, "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. I didn't want you to see me like this." His voice, strong and steady as it had always been, was hardly more than a whisper. Margaret felt something inside her twist, not pity, but grief, private and deep. She wasn't staring at an employee who had fallen on hard times. She was staring at a man who had worked in graciousness through unseen hardship, and whose silence had concealed a storm he was too proud to talk about. For weeks he'd driven her, smiled at her, opened the car door, while slept on benches and showered in gas station restrooms. She sat down next to him without comment, the chill of the bench seeping through her coat, but she didn't mind. He turned away, obviously embarrassed. "I didn't want to ask for assistance," he said softly. "Didn't want to be a burden. I just wanted to retain the job. It's the only thing I had left that made me feel like myself." Margaret nodded slowly, absorbing it all. 3 weeks, earnest, she ventured, though she wasn't certain she wanted to hear the response. He groaned. 3 weeks, rent increase, car died. "I hung in there, ma'am. I swear I did." The words were spoken slowly, each one with a hesitancy that seemed to cause it to struggle over the top of a bulwark of pride. Margaret didn't break in. She simply let him speak. And what she heard was not the tale of a failure, but of a quiet strength. Each day, he rose before dawn, got somewhere to clean up, buttoned his collar, and reported to work as if nothing had changed, because to him, being present mattered most. "I thought if I just kept going," he said, "I might climb out. But life," Margaret was well aware, doesn't always provide us with ladders when we require them. Sometimes people simply fall. And the worst part of it, most of the world doesn't even stop to look. But she had, and now, sitting next to the man she had believed she knew, she realized how much she'd overlooked. She gazed at him, actually looked, and saw more than fatigue. She saw a man still clinging to pride, even after protracted struggle. And in that moment, something changed in her. Not out of guilt, not even out of duty, but out of respect. Ernest had never requested charity. He had requested nothing. But that's what made her decision so clear. This wasn't about giving him a quick fix or writing a check. This was about recognizing a man who had given quietly, loyally, day after day, while carrying a burden no one saw. "You're not going back to that bench," she said gently but firmly. Ever again, he looked at her, unsure. "I don't want to lose the job," he said. "You won't," she answered, "but we're going to do this differently now." And though he didn't fully understand what she meant just yet, there was something in her voice, steady, warm, unshaken, that let him exhale for the first time in weeks. What Margaret did next wouldn't just lift him off that bench. It would rewrite the rest of his life in a way no one saw coming. They sat there side by side on that cold park bench, the early morning light spanning across the ground as the city gradually awakened around them, oblivious of the silent tempest that had just erupted between two people who, until this time, existed in wholly disparate worlds. Margaret wrapped her coat tightly around her, not only against the cold, but against the surge of feeling building up within her as Ernest started to talk, not loudly, nor dramatically, but in the sort of quiet, exhausted candor that can only issue when someone no longer has anything left to guard. His sentences emerged slowly, as if each one was being let go after weeks of repression. "It began when the rent increased," he said, looking at the sidewalk in front of him. "I attempted to keep up with it, cut spending where I could. I don't spend much in the first place." He smiled weakly, then went on, "But I couldn't do it. 1 month I was late, then 2. I attempted to pay it back some time, but the landlord wasn't willing to make an exception." He shifted uncomfortably on the bench, looking embarrassed. "So I slipped away. Didn't want to get in trouble. Slept in the car for a bit. It wasn't much, but it was warm. That held until the engine died." After that, his voice faded away. Margaret didn't push. She let the silence hang there for a moment because she knew sometimes silence is the respect one is owed. He had been homeless for 3 weeks, but continued to wear a tie, hold doors open for her each day, never once asking for assistance. That is strength that doesn't shout, strength that lasts. Ernest gazed at his hands, those very hands that had opened doors for her countless times in the past decade, hefted her suitcases, filled her coffee on early mornings. They now shook with fatigue, gas station sinks. He continued in a low voice. "You'd be amazed at how much you can sweep up if you work at it. You pick up tricks, a little toothpaste, a comb, and a mirror in the back of a diner. People don't pay attention as long as you stay down. His smile wavered then, and for the first time in a very long time, Margaret was actually speechless. She had always considered herself a person who paid attention to details, people patterns, but somehow she had overlooked this. And not because she didn't care, but because Ernest never so much as gave a hint that anything was amiss. He was there every morning on the dot. His uniform was always crisp, his voice always courteous. No griping, no asking questions, just service. Steady, faithful service. "Why didn't you tell me?" she questioned finally, her tone low. Ernest met her gaze, eyes firm but weary. "Because I did not want pity," he replied matter-of-factly. "Did not want to lose the job. That job provided me with something to cling to, provided me with purpose. You entrusted me with your time, your safety, your schedule, and that meant something to me. I did not want to lose that. In a world in which so many ask for everything, this man asked for nothing, and that silent pride was what almost destroyed him." Margaret could feel her throat constricting. Here was a man who had opted for dignity rather than ease, who went to work every day expecting to go to bed on a bench that night and still showed up. Nobody knew, not her employees, not the valet, not the doorman. Ernest had successfully kept his struggle hidden not because he was attempting to mislead, but because he would not be regarded as anything but reliable. "You know," he said after a moment of contemplation, "it's funny what you become accustomed to. Eventually, the cold just becomes a part of the night. The tough part isn't the bench or the noise. It's walking by people and wondering if they'd stare at you differently if they knew." That struck her hard. Margaret was not a crier, but there was something about that sentence, the heaviness of it, the understated truth moved her. Without thinking, she reached over and placed her hand gently on his, grounding them both in a silence that said more than words could. "You're not going back to this," she said finally, her voice firm but kind. "Ever." Ernest looked over at her, unsure if he had heard right. "I don't mean for tonight or just this week," she added, reading the doubt on his face. "Never again, I mean. You've missed no day and given your best, and now it's time for someone to give back to you, not out of shame, not as alms, but because you deserve it." What she intended was not a handout, it was a turning point, and Ernest had no concept of how much his life was about to change. He gazed at her with wary optimism, as if he was reluctant to trust that things might actually improve, and who would not blame him? He had endured weeks of isolation, starvation, and doubt, but still maintained the same dignified reserve that had left him indelible in her memory in the very beginning. Margaret reflected on all the times she had entered that automobile, cup of coffee in her hand, issuing instructions, making phone calls, hardly looking up, never once considering the possibility that the driver was operating on less sleep or sustenance. The fact was, she trusted Ernest because he never provided her with cause not to. But now, knowing the cost of that loyalty, it wasn't enough to say thank you. She needed to do more, much more. And not just because of what he'd been through, but because of who he was underneath it all. Not a struggling man, not a victim, undefined but a human being who never stops showing up. At other times, the ones who serve us in silence are the ones bearing the greatest weight, and when we finally glimpse them, we cannot help but turn away. Margaret wasted not a moment. No sooner did she drop Ernest at a local hotel that morning, providing him with a warm bed, hot food, and a place to breathe safely, than she sat down in her home office and started phoning, silently, deliberately, and without informing others. It wasn't charity or for public admiration. It wasn't for headlines and feel-good news. It was about something more profound. Margaret had made her fortune through strategy, through seeing value where others couldn't, and she saw in Ernest something powerful. He hadn't merely weathered adversity, he had conducted himself with unshakable dignity while enduring it, and that sort of character Margaret knew was too precious to be overlooked. The first thing she did was summon an old friend in real estate. "I want a furnished one, bedroom," she stated, "in a respectable neighborhood." Keen. "And I want it today." In hours, Ernest had the keys to a sunroom apartment off Milton with a comfortable bed, fully stocked kitchen, and room to catch breath again. No cold benches, no more waking up to unfamiliar strangers, just peace. And finally, for weeks, Ernest stood in a space he could at last call home. But Margaret wasn't finished, not by a long shot, because what she was creating wasn't simply a rescue, it was a rebirth. The next on her agenda, her legal team. Margaret had her attorney sit down with Ernest and go over each debt, each overdue notice, each blemish that had been saddling him. She wasn't erasing the slate, she was rebuilding it, more solid this time. Piece by piece, the weights that had accumulated behind his reserved eyes were shed. No theatrics in the courtroom, no protracted paperwork struggles. Simply doors opened discreetly by an individual who could do it, and did with tact. And yet, she wasn't done. The third call was the surprise one, this time to her money man and ex-operations director. "I want to start a business," she declared. "Not for profit, but for individuals like Ernest. Drivers, workers, people who've slipped through the cracks but never lost hope. And I want Ernest to be my first partner." There was a pause on the other end. "And then, you want him as a co-founder?" "Yes," she replied firmly. "He has more leadership in his quietness than others have in a boardroom. He doesn't merely drive a car, he's carrying people. That's the kind of power we need." The world was expecting her to make an offer. Instead, she made him an offer no one anticipated, a seat at the table. In short weeks, the papers were drawn. The company was straightforward but meaningful, a high-end car service that focused on hiring and empowering people who had been homeless but were determined to rebuild their lives. Margaret managed the capital and business infrastructure. And Nest, he added the heart. He assisted in building the process of hiring drivers, defined the company culture, and screened new candidates. Some of the women and men who came through their doors were just like he had once been, exhausted, reserved, uncertain about their future. But Ernest greeted each one with a firm handshake and an open ear, because he understood. He knew what it was to be overlooked, underestimated, and unseen. And now he ensured that no one ever felt that way again. The second company car emerged from the garage 2 months later, low, slung black, with a discreet golden badge off to one side that read, "Second Ride." It was a name Ernest himself had coined. When Margaret asked him why he'd chosen it, he replied, "Because everyone gets one, a second ride, a second chance." He was no longer driving solo. He was assisting others to find their path again. Margaret sat back and watched it all happen with quiet pride, not because she had conceived something new, but because she had just helped uncover something that was already present. Ernest didn't require rescuing. He needed to be noticed, and once he was noticed, there was no preventing what he could create. Customers started to notice. The drivers weren't simply polite, they were thankful. Every ride was intimate. Every hello came with affection. Word of mouth carried the day, and second ride was booking regular. Clients, executives, wedding parties, even corporate airport pickups. Ernest, once humble and reserved, now strode into meetings with quiet confidence. He wore his suit as if it were his own, not only because it was new, but because it suited the man he had always been on the inside. And Margaret, she still had her empire, her meetings, her life that was slicked, but she fitted in to go by the office on a regular basis, to see drivers, to sit through interviews, because now she knew sometimes the true power isn't going up the ladder, it's getting down it for the next person and letting them go up. She didn't use her money to bail out Ernest. She used it to bring him back. And in doing so, she constructed something much greater than either of them could have imagined. And when the headlines finally discovered and attempted to spin it, "Millionaire rescues driver from the streets," Margaret turned down every interview. She did not want to be the subject of a feel-good story. She wanted Ernest and the other Ernests out there to be. That was the point. And Ernest, he continued to arrive early every morning, wore the same quiet smile, watched peak. But now he entered an office bearing his name on the glass, sat at a desk he assisted in constructing, and greeted a staff he assisted in training. He was no longer a figure lurking in the background of her life's business. He was its heart. But now the world was experiencing what she'd learned, that true value is not always boisterous. It can simply sit quietly on a park bench and wait to be noticed. Ernest didn't only receive a house or an employment opportunity, he received his voice. And in the process, he provided that same hope to other riders who were yet to receive their second ride. 6 months on, if you ever drove through the same quiet Boston street, the one with worn sidewalks, weathered benches, and trees that line up like old friends, you'd hear something new, something hopeful. Nestled between a bakery and a used bookstore now sits a small but polished office with clean windows and a bright blue awning. And just above the door, in simple gold lettering, you'd read the words, "Second Ride Chauffeurs Driven with Dignity." A lot of people don't know the story behind that name, but those who step inside quickly feel something different. There's a sense of purpose in the air. Inside, you'll often find Ernest near the front desk, not in a uniform this time, but in a well-fitted suit, crisp white shirt, polished shoes. His smile, though, is the same, warm, genuine, strong. He's sitting across from a fidgety applicant, perhaps someone who hasn't had a solid place to sleep in weeks, or someone who's been passed over time after time due to one bad stretch too many. But Ernest leans in when he hears. He doesn't interrogate. Instead, he speaks a part of himself, soft-spoken and low-key. Here's what it's like to be invisible, he says on occasion, but here's also what it is when someone finally notices you. And in that instant, something changes in the air. Because the thing they heard about, the man once spotted on a bench, sits before them, not as a memory of things past, but as testament to what can be done. Second Ride is not merely an automobile service anymore. It's a community, it's a second chance, and it begins with respect, not giveaways. Margaret had supplied the vision, yes, but Ernest had defined its heart. Every driver who walks in the door is treated with respect, trained with precision, and entrusted with genuine authority. They put on suits because they are worthy of dressing the part. They arrive early because they finally have something to boast about. And Margaret, she continues to fill her calendar with board meetings, fundraisers, dinner at nice restaurants. Those activities, although still a part of her universe, no longer define her in the same way as before. Now, whenever she passes by that gold-lettered sign on the corner, she recalls that day in the park, the frost adhering to the bench, the way Ernest had glanced up at her with weary eyes and unspoken strength. That image never changed. Because sometimes the smallest thing, a missed morning, a park bench, a single exchange, can alter not just one life, but several. She still has her driver too. Ernest arrives every day in a corporate car, as always on time. But now, when he gets out to open her door, there is something different in the look they exchange. No longer employer and employee, but partners in something greater, friends, in the truest sense, allies in an unspoken mission neither of them envisioned, but both of them joined. There is no requirement for words. There is only a shared glance, a smile, a nod, and in the end, together they recall, not with regret but with appreciation. Because though Margaret offered resources and scope, it was Ernest who offered courage, who reminded her and the world what true strength doesn't include a great shout. What true success isn't counted in dollars, but in the number of people you've touched. True wealth isn't about reaching the top alone. It's about whom you lift when nobody is looking. The business kept expanding. They moved into 2 additional cities in the first year, not pursuing profits but creating possibilities. Ernest started mentoring other managers, teaching them how to lead from the heart, not from fear. Margaret assisted with contracts from hotels and airports, behind the scenes keeping the mission from being lost in the money. And they created something that endured, not a headline, not an instant of philanthropy, but a movement on the basis of trust, dignity, and second chances. Occasionally, Ernest goes back to that park, the one with the same old bench under the same old tree, not to linger, not to pity, but to recall. He'll sit there for a few minutes, hands folded in his lap, staring out across the space where it all began to shift. It was simply a bench. Simply a winter morning. Simply a moment, but from that one moment, a new beginning emerged, a better one. And every individual who today draws a paycheck, who sports that blue denim jacket with Second Ride embroidered over the chest, has a small part of that story in them. They won't necessarily know all the facts, but they sense it in the way they're treated, in the way they're trusted, in the way they're perceived. That's what Margaret created, not a company, but a legacy. And not with money, so much as with the choice to view a man not as an issue, but as a human being. As the world hurtles along with its din and headlines, Margaret and Ernest go on, in silence. No camera crews, no parades, just intent. And when that shiny black car pulls up to her house each morning, and Ernest gets out, they share a smile, that's all, because no words are required. They both recall one park bench, one man who never surrendered, one woman who opted to look beyond, and one act of mercy that became a new life, not for him alone, but for all who would come after. That, to be sure, is the true strength of a second ride. Sometimes life gently reminds us that the people who walk beside us, quiet, steady, and dependable, may be carrying more than we'll ever know. In the rush of routines and responsibilities, it's easy to overlook the silent strength of others, until one moment opens our eyes. Margaret didn't just help Ernest because she could. She chose to see him, really see him, and respond with dignity instead of pity. And in doing this, she did more than just give support. She gave respect and a second chance based on trust. We have all had those moments where we need to slow down and ask ourselves, am I really paying attention? Maybe sometimes it's in the little things, taking a moment to listen, deciding to act with kindness, that true change starts. Because at the end of the day, what we are left with isn't necessarily the roles we took on or the titles we held. It's how we lifted each other when it most mattered.